Further persecutions in the valleys of Piedmont in the 17th century. Giovanni Palancione, for refusing to turn papist, was tied by one leg to the tail of a mule and dragged through the streets of Lucerne amidst the acclamations of an inhuman mob, who kept stoning him and crying out, "He is possessed with the devil," so that neither stoning nor dragging him through the streets will kill him, for the devil keeps him alive. They then took him to the riverside, chopped off his head, and left that and his body unburied upon the bank of the stream. Magdalene, the daughter of Peter Fontaine, a beautiful child of 10 years of age, was ravished and murdered by the soldiers. Another girl of about the same age they roasted alive at Villanova, and a poor woman, hearing that the soldiers were coming toward her house, snatched up the cradle in which her infant son was asleep and fled toward the woods. The soldiers, however, saw and pursued her, when she lightened herself by putting down the cradle and child, which the soldiers no sooner came to than they murdered the infant, and continuing the pursuit, found the mother in a cave, where they first ravished and then cut her to pieces. Jacob Michelino, chief elder of the church of Bobbio, and several other Protestants were hung up by means of hooks fixed in their bellies and left to expire in the most excruciating tortures. Giovanni Rostignol, a venerable Protestant, upwards of 80 years of age, had his nose and ears cut off and slices cut from the fleshly parts of his body until he bled to death. 7 persons, Daniel Saligio and his wife Giovanni Durant, Lodvig Durant, Bartholomew Durant, Daniel Ravel, and Paul Renaud, had their mouths stuffed with gunpowder, which being set fire to, their heads were blown to pieces. Jacob Barone, a schoolmaster of Roreda, for refusing to change his religion, was stripped quite naked, and after having been very indecently exposed, had the nails of his toes and fingers torn off with red-hot pincers, and holes bored through his hands with the point of a dagger. He then had a cord tied round his middle, and was led through the streets with a soldier on each side of him. At every turn, the soldier on his right-hand side cut a gash in his flesh, and the soldier on his left-hand side struck him with a bludgeon, both saying at the same instant, "Will you go to Mass? Will you go to Mass?" He still replied in the negative to these interrogatories, and being at length taken to the bridge, they cut off his head, and on the balustrades, and threw both that and his body into the river. Paul Garnier, a very pious Protestant, had his eyes put out, was then flayed alive, and being divided into 4 parts, his quarters were placed on 4 of the principal houses of Lucerne. He bore all his sufferings with the most exemplary patience, praised God as long as he could speak, and plainly evinced what confidence and resignation a good conscience can inspire. Daniel Cardone of Roccapiata, being apprehended by some soldiers, they cut his head off, and having fried his brains, ate them. 2 poor old blind women of St. Giovanni were burnt alive, and a widow of Latour, with her daughter, were driven into the river, and there stoned to death. Paul Giles, on attempting to run away from some soldiers, was shot in the neck. They then slit his nose, sliced his chin, stabbed him, and gave his carcass to the dogs. Some of the Irish troops, having taken 11 men of Garcigliana prisoners, they made a furnace red hot and forced them to push each other in until they came to the last man, whom they pushed in themselves. Michael Gonnet, a man of 90, was burnt to death. Baptiste Udry, another old man, was stabbed, and Bartholomew Frosch had holes made in his heels, through which ropes were put. Then he was dragged by them to jail, where his wounds mortified and killed him. Magdalene de la Pierre, being pursued by some of the soldiers and taken, was thrown down a precipice and dashed to pieces. Margaret Ravella and Mary Pravalerin, 2 very old women, were burnt alive, and Michael Bellino, with Anne Bacardno, were beheaded. The son and the daughter of a counselor of Giovanni were rolled down a steep hill together, and suffered to perish in a deep pit at the bottom. A tradesman's family, himself, his wife, and an infant in her arms, were cast from a rock and dashed to pieces, and Joseph Charret and Paul Carniero were flayed alive. Cipriano Bustia, being asked if he would renounce his religion and turn Roman Catholic, replied, "I would rather renounce life or turn dog." To which a priest answered, "For that expression you shall both renounce life and be given to the dogs." They accordingly dragged him to prison, where he continued a considerable time without food until he was famished, after which they threw his corpse into the street before the prison, and it was devoured by dogs in the most shocking manner. Margaret Soretta was stoned to death and then thrown into the river. Antonio Bartina had his head cleft asunder, and Joseph Pont was cut through the middle of his body. Daniel Maria and his whole family being ill of a fever, several papist ruffians broke into his house, telling him they were practical physicians and would give them all present ease, which they did by knocking the whole family on the head. 3 infant children of a Protestant named Peter Fine were covered with snow and stifled. An elderly widow named Judith was beheaded, and a beautiful young woman was stripped naked and had a stake driven through her body, of which she expired. Lucy, the wife of Peter Besson, a woman far gone in her pregnancy who lived in one of the villages of the Piedmontese valleys, determined, if possible, to escape from such dreadful scenes as everywhere surrounded her. She accordingly took 2 young children, one in each hand, and set off towards the Alps. But on the 3rd day of the journey she was taken in labor among the mountains and delivered of an infant, who perished through the extreme inclemency of the weather, as did the other 2 children, for all 3 were found dead by her, and herself just expiring, by the person to whom she related the above particulars. Francis Gross, the son of a clergyman, had his flesh slowly cut from his body into small pieces, and put into a dish before him. 2 of his children were minced before his sight, and his wife was fastened to a post, that she might behold all these cruelties practiced on her husband and offspring. The tormentors at length, being tired of exercising these cruelties, cut off the heads of both husband and wife, and then gave the flesh of the whole family to the dogs. The Sieur Thomas Marger fled to a cave, when the soldiers shut up the mouth, and he perished with famine. Judith Revelin and 7 children were barbarously murdered in their beds, and a widow of near 80 years of age was hewn to pieces by soldiers. Jacob Rossino was ordered to pray to the saints, which he absolutely refused to do. Some of the soldiers beat him violently with bludgeons to make him comply, but he, still refusing, several of them fired at him and lodged a great many balls in his body. As he was almost expiring, they cried to him, "Will you call upon the saints? Will you pray to the saints?" To which he answered 3 times, "No." When one of the soldiers with the broadsword clove his head asunder, and put an end to his sufferings in this world, for which undoubtedly he is gloriously rewarded in the next. A soldier attempting to ravish a young woman named Susan Gauquin, she made a stout resistance, and in the struggle pushed him over a precipice, when he was dashed to pieces by the fall. His comrades, instead of admiring the virtue of the young woman and applauding her for so nobly defending her chastity, fell upon her with their swords and cut her to pieces. Giovanni Pujos, a poor peasant of Latour, being apprehended as a Protestant by the soldiers, was ordered by the Marquis of Pianesta to be executed in a place near the convent. When he came to the gallows, several monks attended, and did all they could to persuade him to renounce his religion. But he told them he never would embrace idolatry, and that he was happy at being thought worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. They then put him in mind of what his wife and children, who depended upon his labor, would suffer after his decease, to which he replied, "I would have my wife and children, as well as myself, to consider their souls more than their bodies, in the next world before this, and with respect to the distress I may leave them in, God is merciful, and will provide for them while they are worthy of this protection." Finding the inflexibility of this poor man, the monks cried, "Turn him off! Turn him off!" which the executioner did almost immediately, and the body being afterward cut down, was flung into the river. Paul Clement, an elder of the church of Rossana, being apprehended by the monks of a neighboring monastery, was carried to the marketplace of that town, where some Protestants had just been executed by the soldiers. He was shown the dead bodies, and ordered that the sight might intimidate him. On beholding the shocking subjects, he said calmly, "You may kill the body, but you cannot prejudice the soul of a true believer with respect to the dreadful spectacles which you have here shown me. You may rest assured that God's vengeance will overtake the murderers of those poor people and punish them for the innocent blood they have spilt." The monks were so exasperated at this reply that they ordered him to be hanged directly, and while he was hanging, the soldiers amused themselves in standing at a distance and shooting at the body as a mark. Daniel Rambat of Valerio, the father of a numerous family, was apprehended and with several others committed to prison in the jail Paisana. Here he was visited by several priests who with continual importunities did all they could to persuade him to renounce the Protestant religion and turn papist, but this he peremptorily refused, and the priests, finding his resolution, pretended to pity his numerous family, and told him that he might yet have his life if he would subscribe to the belief of the following articles. 1. The real presence of the host. 2. Transubstantiation. 3. Purgatory. 4. The Pope's infallibility. 5. The Masses said for the dead will release souls from purgatory. 6. That praying to saints will procure the remission of sins. Rambat told the priest that neither his religion, his understanding, nor his conscience would suffer him to subscribe to any of the articles for the following reasons. 1. That to believe the real presence is the host is a shocking union of both blasphemy and idolatry. 2. That to fancy the words of consecration perform what the papists called transubstantiation by converting the wafer and wine into the real and identical body and blood of Christ, which was crucified, and which afterward ascended into heaven, is too gross an absurdity for even a child to believe, who was come to the least glimmering of a reason that nothing but the most superstition could make the Roman Catholics put a confidence in anything so completely ridiculous. 3. That the doctrine of purgatory was more inconsistent and absurd than a fairy tale. 4. That the Pope's being infallible was an impossibility, and the Pope arrogantly laid claim to what could belong to God only as a perfect being. 5. That saying masses for the dead was ridiculous and only meant to keep up with the belief in the fallible purgatory, as the fate of all is finally decided on the departure of the soul from the body. 6. That praying to the saints for the remission of sins is misplacing adoration, as the saints themselves have occasion for an intercessor in Christ. Therefore, as God can only pardon our errors, we ought to sue him alone for pardon. The priests were so highly offended at Rambat's answers to the articles to which they would have had him subscribe, that they determined to shake his resolution by the most cruel method imaginable. They ordered one joint of his finger to be cut off every day until all fingers were gone. They then proceeded in the same manner with his toes. Afterward, they alternately cut off daily a hand and a foot, but finding that he bore his sufferings with the most admirable patience, increased both in fortitude and resignation, and maintained his faith with steadfast resolution and unshaken constancy, they stabbed him to the heart, and then gave his body to be devoured by the dogs. Peter Gabriola, a Protestant gentleman of considerable eminence, being seized by a troop of soldiers and refusing to renounce his religion, they hung a great number of little bags of gunpowder about his body, and then setting fire to them, blew him up. Anthony, the son of Samuel Cadieres, a poor dumb lad who was extremely inoffensive, was cut to pieces by a party of the troops, and soon after the same ruffians entered the house of Peter Martyrs and cut off the legs of the whole family, leaving them to bleed to death, as they were unable to assist themselves or to help each other. Daniel Benek, being apprehended, had his nose slit, his ears cut off, and was then divided into quarters, each quarter being hung upon a tree. And Mary Menino had her jawbones broke and was then left to anguish till she was famished. Mary Palanchian, a handsome widow belonging to the town of Valerio, was seized by a party of the Irish brigades, and having beat her cruelly and ravished her, dragged her to a high bridge which crossed the river, and stripped her naked in a most indecent manner, hung her by the legs to the bridge, with her head downwards toward the water, and then going into the boats, they fired at her until she expired. Mary Negrino and her daughter were cut to pieces in the woods, and their bodies left to be devoured by wild beasts. Susanna Bales, a widow of Valerio, was immured until she perished through hunger, and Susanna Carvalho, running away from the soldiers and hiding herself in a barn, they set fire to the straw and burnt her. Paul Armand was hacked to pieces. A child named Daniel Bertino was burnt. Daniel Michelino had his tongue plucked out and was left to perish in that condition. And Andrea Bertino, a very old man who was lame, was mangled in a most shocking manner, and at length had his belly ripped open and his bowels carried about on a point of a halbert. Constantia Bellion, a Protestant lady being apprehended on account of her faith, was asked by a priest if she would renounce the devil and go to Mass, to which she replied, "I was brought up in a religion by which I was always taught to renounce the devil. But should I comply with your desire and go to Mass, I should be sure to meet him there in a variety of shapes." The priest was highly incensed at what she said, and told her to recant, or she would suffer cruelly. The lady, however, boldly answered that she valued not any suffering she could inflict, and in spite of all the torments he could invent, she would keep her conscience pure and her faith inviolate. The priest then ordered slices of her flesh to be cut off from several parts of her body, which cruelly she bore with the most singular patience, only saying to the priest, "What horrid and lasting torments will you suffer in hell for the trifling and temporary pains which I now endure?" Exasperated at this expression and willing to stop her tongue, the priest ordered a file of musketeers to draw up and fire upon her, by which she was soon dispatched, and sealed her martyrdom with her blood. A young woman named Judith Mandan, for refusing to change her religion and embrace popery, was fastened to a stake, and sticks thrown at her from a distance in the very same manner as that barbarous custom which was formerly practiced Shrove Tuesday. In the very same manner as that barbarous custom which was formerly practiced on Shrove Tuesday, of shying at rocks, as it was termed. By this inhuman proceeding, the poor creature's limbs were beat and mangled in a terrible manner, and her brains were at last dashed out by one of the bludgeons. David Paglia and Paul Jeanret, attempting to escape to the Alps with each his son, were pursued and overtaken by the soldiers in a large plain. Here they hunted them for the diversion, goading them with their swords and making them run about until they dropped down with fatigue. When they found that their spirits were quite exhausted and that they could not afford them any more barbarous sport by running, the soldiers hacked them to pieces and left their mangled bodies on the spot. A young man of Bobbio, named Michael Grevet, was apprehended in the town of La Tour, and being led to the bridge was thrown over into the river. As he could swim very well, he swam down the stream, thinking to escape, but the soldiers in the mob followed on both sides of the river and kept stoning him, until receiving a blow on one of his temples, he was stunned and consequently sunk and was drowned. David Armand was ordered to lay his head down on a block when a soldier with a large hammer beat out his brains. David Baradona, being apprehended at Valario, was carried to La Tour, where, refusing to renounce his religion, he was tormented by means of brimstone matches being tied between his fingers and toes and set fire to, and afterward having his flesh plucked off with red-hot pincers until he expired. And Giovanni Barolina, with his wife, were thrown into a pool of stagnant water and compelled, by means of pitchforks and stones, to duck down their heads until they were suffocated. A number of soldiers went to the house of Joseph Garniero, and before they entered, fired in at the window to give notice of their approach. A musket ball entered one of Miss Garniero's breast as she was suckling an infant with the other. On finding their intentions, she begged hard that they would spare the life of the infant, which they promised to do, and sent it immediately to a Roman Catholic nurse. They then took the husband and hanged him in his own door, and having shot the wife through the head, they left her body weltering in its blood, and her husband hanging on the gallows. Isaiah Mondon, an elderly man and a pious Protestant, fled from the merciless persecutors to a cleft in a rock, where he suffered the most dreadful hardships, for in the midst of the winter he was forced to lie on the bare stone without any covering. His food was the roots which he scratched up near his miserable habitation, and the only way by which he could procure drink was to put snow in his mouth until it melted. Here, however, some of the inhuman soldiers found him, and having beaten him unmercifully, they drove him towards Lucerne, goading him with the points of their swords. Being exceedingly weakened by this manner of living, and his spirits exhausted by the blows he had received, he fell down in the road. They again beat him to make him proceed, when on his knees he implored them to put him out of his misery by dispatching him. This they at last agreed to do, and one of them, stepping up to him, shot him through the head with a pistol, saying, "There, heretic, take thy request." Mary Revol, a worthy Protestant, received a shot in her back as she was walking along the street. She dropped down with the wound, but recovering sufficient strength, she raised herself upon her knees, and lifting her hands towards heaven, prayed in a most fervent manner to the Almighty, when a number of soldiers who were near at hand fired a whole volley of shot at her, many of which took effect and put an end to her miseries in an instant. Several men, women, and children secreted themselves in a large cave, where they continued for some weeks in safety. It was the custom for 2 of the men to go when it was necessary, and by stealth procure provisions. These were, however, one day watched, by which the cave was discovered, and soon after a troop of Roman Catholics appeared before it. The Papists that assembled upon this occasion were neighbors and intimate acquaintances of the Protestants in the cave. Some were even related to each other. The Protestants therefore came out and implored them by the ties of hospitality, by the ties of blood, and as old acquaintances and neighbors not to murder them. But superstition overcomes every sensation of nature and humanity, so that the papists, blinded by bigotry, told them that they could not show any mercy to heretics, and therefore bade them prepare to die. Hearing this, and knowing the fatal obstinacy of the Roman Catholics, the Protestants all fell prostrate, lifting their hands and hearts to heaven, prayed with great sincerity and fervency, and then bowing down, put their faces close to the ground, and patiently waited their fate, which was soon decided. For the papists fell upon them with unremitting fury, and having cut them to pieces, left the mangled bodies and limbs in the cave. Giovanni Salvio, passing by a Roman Catholic church and not taking off his hat, was followed by some of the congregation, who fell upon and murdered him, and Jacob Beryl and his wife, having been taken prisoners by the Earl of St. Secondo, one of the Duke of Savoy's officers, he delivered them up to the soldiery, who cut off the woman's breast and the man's nose, and then shot them both through the head. Anthony Guio, a Protestant of a wavering disposition, went to Pereiro with an intent to renounce his religion and embrace popery. This design he communicated to some priests who highly commended it, and a day was fixed upon for his public recantation. In the meantime, Anthony grew fully sensible of his treachery, and his conscience tormented him so much night and day that he determined not to recant, but to make his escape. This he effected, but being soon missed and pursued, he was taken. The troops on the way did all they could to bring him back to his design of recantation, but finding their endeavors ineffectual, they beat him violently on the road. When coming near a precipice, he took an opportunity of leaping down it and dashed to pieces. A Protestant gentleman of considerable fortune at Bobbio, being nightly provoked by the insolence of a priest, retorted with great severity, and among other things said that the Pope was Antichrist, mass idolatry, purgatory a farce, and absolution a cheat. To be revenged, the priest hired 5 desperate ruffians, who the same evening broke into the gentleman's house and seized upon him in a violent manner. The gentleman was terribly frightened, fell on his knees, and implored mercy, but the desperate ruffians dispatched him without the least hesitation.